My name is Sari van Pooyen, and I'm the Director of Team Agility in Intact Academy. In Team Agility, we help businesses develop their business more quickly than their products so that they're quicker on market. Within Intact Academy, what we do is we train coaches and consultants all over the world to help businesses innovate. I've been doing that for 35 years, and I still love my job. This series of blogs is really a way for me to transfer my knowledge after 35 years in the business. And today I'd really like to talk to you about the development of autocratic systems. I've been getting a lot of questions about this because in the world today, post-Corona or during Corona, we're actually seeing a development. Some systems are becoming more democratic and more refocused. They're actually embracing this change of paradigm from individual responsibility to collective responsibility. And in other countries, we're really seeing that they're developing more autocratically. They're enforcing rules and military rule even. And so I became really fascinated. What is it that makes this possible in some countries and not in others? I remember I wrote an article in, I think it was the beginning 1990s, where I actually described the development of autocratic systems. The reason I wrote that article was because I was so shocked with what happened in Waco in Texas. I don't know if you remember this, but we had a sect by David Koresh, and the FBI came and they actually burnt the whole building with women and children in it. And I thought, how is this possible in a country that calls itself democratic? And throughout my life, I've been working in countries, many different countries, teaching transactional analysis, but also training coaches and consultants and leaders. And in these different countries, I've always been fascinated by the rules of government. How is it that in some countries you see this kind of autocratic rule that really emerged during this Waco incident in the 1990s, and in some countries you don't? My fascination was as an organizational consultant. So I'm not so interested in the politics of it, though I have an opinion about it. But professionally, I'm really interested about how this can develop organically. How does an organization develop from a democratic to an autocratic system, or vice versa? What I found is actually there's very, very little difference in the development between autocratic and democratic systems. But I'm going to tell you about that in a second. So during my research, what I found is that autocratic system development goes through 5 stages. So the first stage, you have an autocratic leader, a very strong leader who's usually, we call them promoters in other, yes, we'd call them probably narcissists as well. But they're very strong leaders in any case, and they have this idea. And what they do is they become a crowd crystal. We call that a crowd crystal. And because what happens is they have an idea, they want to form a group, and then people crystallize around them. They actually create a dependent relationship with them. So we see a master and a follower. And really, I'm not talking about a leader, I'm really talking about a master. And these followers really crystallize around this master because they're looking for strong leadership in uncertain times. And that's what makes it really scary in these post-COVID times, because many of us are looking for strong leadership. Some of us aren't. But what happens is when you see these people, these followers come up, they're looking at they're over-adapting to a system just to belong and to be led. So at this point, you have a master and some followers, and it's still a mass, it's undefined. So there's not very strong boundaries around it, But everyone is really, the attachment to the leader is what's most important. In actual fact, the same thing happens in the democratic system. You have a leader and a follower. The only difference is the degree of dependency. So in stage two, really what we see is an establishment of boundaries and roles. So that also happens in the democratic system. The difference in an autocratic system is that you have a boundary around the system which is not permeable. So that means you can come in, but you can't go out. And once you're in, actually, what happens is that you have to give up your identity. So most sects and autocratic systems work on the basis that once you're in, you become a number. And that can be, you know, any kind of number. But you have to give up your name. Often you have to give up your possessions. It belongs to the state. We see that in sects, but we also see that statewide. Within that enclosed space, the master becomes like a mythical figure. He gets kind of omnipotent characteristics within that space. The way that is done is by becoming quite invisible. And when you're visible, by acting like an autocratic narcissist, really. So you claim everything, but you become quite mysterious. That's the way to do it, because as long as there's mystery, you're not human. And as long as you're not human, you're godlike in that space. So that's what happens usually within a sect, but also within an autocratic system. You can see that in governments as well. In many autocratic systems, the leader becomes a master and becomes quite mythical. Look at Putin. Look at look at Trump, if you want to talk about that. He acts like he's God within his own domain. What also happens at a third stage is that the master starts to impose more and more rules on the followers. So they have to give up more and more of themselves to become part of the system. Now, in a sect, that's quite obvious. You get a new name, the master impregnates the female followers, they get children. This is what happened in Waco, that's why I'm saying it. And the master establishes legitimacy by actually almost symbolically beating down anyone who would challenge his authority. And you see that now as well. I do understand all these protests in America at the moment and the sweeping across the world. It's not just the fact that George Floyd died and the way he died and was actually murdered by a police force which was supposed to keep the justice going, but it's also, I think, a protest against this demand of a master further and further subjugation of his followers. When you protest, you get military rule. That's unheard of in a democratic system. So what does that tell us about the United States today, by the way? What the master does when this followership becomes too big is he appoints lieutenants. Now, in a democratic system, you'd appoint departmental managers, I guess, but they have a degree of freedom. Lieutenants don't. They're the representation of the master, and they actually are the extended arm of the master, if you want. You usually have two types of lieutenants. You have lieutenants who maintain the internal control in a system, and you have lieutenants who recruit externally. I lived in Saudi Arabia, and in Saudi Arabia, you can really see these two types of lieutenants. So you have a police, which is ordered to upkeep the moral law. So they actually patrol to see if Westerners have more than 10 people in a room or are celebrating Christian holidays. And you have military that are there to upkeep the external control and the boundaries, as it were. So military police. So you have moral and military police. It's very much the same in a sect. You have moral and military. So the moral upkeeps the law for the master in the system so that he can become invisible. I keep on saying he because most sect leaders are men. Some of them, of course, are women, but there you go. And then you have military police who upkeep the external boundaries and who are the only ones allowed outside to recruit people. So usually at this point, to strengthen that external boundaries, to really keep people in the system, what the master does is he identifies an external enemy. Because as long as you have an external enemy, there's a validation of the fact that you keep the gates closed, as it were. You can see that in sects very clearly. It's us and them, and sometimes it goes so far that people actually commit mass suicide. We've seen that with Jones. But in countries, you see that as well. Many times you see the enforcement of a power position by closing the external boundaries and then identifying an external enemy, one way or the other. So in the States, you know, they've had to change enemy quite a bit. It was Iraq, and then it was Russia, and then now it's China. But in any case, it's a strategy to validate the fact that you isolate yourself and that you uphold a mastership within the system. What happens sometimes is that with the establishment, and that's really the stage 4 of this development of autocratic system, with this establishment of lieutenants, of course, you also bring in a risk because a lieutenant acts on your behalf. So in a way, you bestow power on them. And then the question comes, you know, who's going to control the lieutenants? Am I my brother's keeper? You know, kind of like that. The appointment of lieutenants inherently weakens the position of the master, but he's got to do it because else it's impossible to upkeep a volume of system. So how can you diminish the risk of being overthrown by your lieutenants? One of the things we see in autocratic systems is that immediately the laws against treason and the rewards for betrayal, the rewards for talking, snitching on betrayal are heightened. So in Eastern Germany, you saw the Stasi. In Hungary, you saw the internal police as well. Anytime you have a mastership where you establish autocratic systems, you see these laws for treason are immediate execution, and people are actually rewarded for snitching. So you can, the public execution of lieutenants is quite normal, but as a strategy to upkeep this closure of boundaries and this mastership. I'm talking about this quite clinically because I'm looking at it as an organizational consultant, not because as a human being I'd have quite a different reaction, but I'm talking to you about the fact that an autocratic system can be quite easily established if you follow these 5 steps. I'm not recommending it, by the way. The 5th step, usually, if you really close a system, look, what happens, you can imagine if you hermetically seal a balloon, but you keep on blowing on it, it pops. And that's usually what happens in an autocratic system. It implodes or it explodes. So, or there's a coup. Sometimes, nowadays, there are other alternatives, organizationally speaking, and we'll talk about that in a second. So what happens to a master in a sect? Just imagine this. So it's a closed system. He's isolated. He makes himself scarce, so less visible. and lieutenants act on his behalf. What happens is this master usually becomes quite paranoid, and um, this I can't trust anyone means they move into a constant paranoia persecutor position, and they increasingly become the victim of their own organization, because as they become less visible, the lieutenants more visible, they become less needed. And so you see that the field is ripe for a coup. This is usually when a coup happens. Unfortunately for us, when a lieutenant takes over an autocratic system, they continue an autocracy. It's very, very, very rare that it becomes democratic. It's interesting because sometimes you see foreign powers supporting lieutenants to do this coup in the hope that democracy will be reestablished, but it's really extremely rare. Um, so sometimes a coup happens, sometimes you see that it implodes the system. So for instance, the paranoia of the master becomes so great that he mass destructs the system. That also happens. So then foreign powers take over, or there's an implosion. As I said, we've had sex with mass suicides, which is absolutely tragic. But it happens not only because people become delusional, but as a logical consequence of the organizational development of the system. That's what I'm trying to explain. So how can we really make sure that this doesn't happen? I'm going to talk about that in the next blog.